delighted to have my dear friend and longtime colleague, Hala Khouri, with me here today. Hi, Hala.
Hi, Julian.
If you're watching this, if you're listening to this, Hala probably needs no introduction to you, but I will just say she's been a yoga teacher for decades. Hala has a master's in clinical psychology, just completed her second master's in community psychology. She is an academic. She's on her way towards a PhD in community psychology. Hala has been a real pioneer in terms of taking the yoga community in directions that have to do both with trauma psychology and to do with social justice awareness and being more politically informed and politically active. She's the co-founder of Off the Mat Into the World. And I'm really proud to say that she and I have done a lot of work together in the yoga community with training teachers around a lot of these sorts of related topics as well. So welcome, Hala. Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm so happy to be here, Julian. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So the episode today, we're really talking about self-care, but it's of course self-care in the context of the moment that we're living through right now, which needs, of course, no unpacking because it's one of these, I was saying to someone the other day, it feels similar to like 9/11 or to the big earthquake that happened in 2004 in that there's this unusual moment where everyone is having a shared experience.
Yeah.
And sometimes in moments like that, there's a heightened sense of empathy. It's like there's a wall that comes down and we go, oh, wow, we're all vulnerable and we all are feeling the effect of the same thing at the same time. Whereas so often what's going on is everyone is, on different timelines. Everyone is experiencing different things based on the circles they move in, based on what matters to them. But it's different than, say, the earthquake, if I think back to when that happened. I don't know if you were in LA at that time.
No.
Yeah. It's different than that because it goes on and on and on. You get to a point where there's emotional exhaustion and there's actually, I notice sometimes there's a desire to not even talk to people about it because it's like, yeah, we all know. We
Yeah.
know
How much more?
what's happening. It sucks and we're struggling with it and we're all struggling in the same ways. So it's this weird kind of juxtaposition. The election is coming up very, very soon. When this episode drops, the election will be like 4 days away. I think many of us feel a sort of a hopefulness about a deep sigh of relief that can happen if the
Yeah.
election goes the way we want it to. But at the same time, there's all of this sort of traumatic association from 2016 of going, don't count your chickens before they,
Exactly.
right? And then at the same time, there's the reality of all of this conspiracy incursion into the spaces that you and I inhabit, into the communities that we're part of. A lot of it is very dark, far right conspiracy stuff. Some of it has other flavors about it, but you've been part of making a stand against that. And so I just want to open it up in terms of this first little section, in terms of where you're at, how you're feeling about all of this, what you're observing. You and I haven't really talked in any depth about that.
Yeah. I mean, I am at, and especially as I know we're trying to talk about self-care, a lot of my self-care has been about like my media consumption, where
Mm.
I'm engaging. And I think, in the beginning, I was like, really wanting to call out all the misinformation and the disinformation. And I'm still fully dedicated to that, and I'm trying to not get too caught up in the drama of it, trying to remember, that there's good human beings out there, and trying to make sure that in this day of physical distancing, I'm not becoming immobilized to really taking in the nurturing of the connections that matter to me, because I can get really caught up, as often happens when we're stressed, right? We are hyper vigilant to the bad, right? So I just want to look for the information, the people, the beliefs that are wrong or bad. And yeah, I am truly worried. I'm really worried about our culture, and I think that any time, whether it's psychologically or physically, change is about to happen, the resistance comes up really strongly. So I'm trying to create a framework that doesn't bypass how shitty all of this is, but also can maybe frame it as potentially, right? We don't know, right? The potential for growth that comes on the other side of that as well. So I've been trying, I'm reading a really beautiful book right now called Healing Resistance. And the author is asking us to think about the arc, the arc of the universe, right? Bends towards justice. Right now, we might not see that at all, right? But the further we pull back, if I can think about the next 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, it's kind of like with trauma, right? I might be feeling a lot of pain, but that if I can feel my pain within the context of the room that I'm in and the city that I'm in and the world, there's something bigger that's holding our pain.
Mm.
So a lot of my work right now has been to acknowledge the pain of the moment, all the terrible things that are happening, and try to hold it within a larger arc of time. That allows me to feel the pain and the possibility at the same time.
Mhm.
That's been a really important coping strategy that I'm trying to cultivate right now.
Powerful. It's really beautiful. I mean, what I hear you saying is part of what happens when we're confronted with overwhelming experience, overwhelming feelings, and everything that that sort of brings up in terms of how we react to that. We can get really contracted and narrowed down, and some of that is inevitable, and some of it is appropriate, and it all makes sense, right? And yet
Totally.
there is some relief perhaps to be had in remembering a larger context, and that there are possibilities, and that life will continue continue moving and expanding and doing what it does.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And also, as somebody who has enough protection right now that I can do that, right? Like my partner is employed, right? I'm not as employed, right? I have a little breathing room because I'm not in a daily survival, right? There's folks out there that are impacted by this in a way where they're in daily survival, and there isn't the space to say, let me think about this in the long term,
Yeah.
right? So I think, even though everybody's impacted, we're impacted really differently. And then our capacity is different based on that impact. And so I think we all have different roles to play. And so I feel like that's one of my roles.
Yeah, it's so interesting. In preparing for this episode, I definitely find myself wanting to dance along that line, right? Between how do we talk about self-care in ways that really acknowledge its crucial necessity, but not perpetuating some of the same old sort of spiritual bypass or unconscious privilege
Yeah,
mistakes, right? So
exactly.
in a way, it's like, okay, count your blessings, so to speak, but also recognize that there's a level of privilege and good fortune that
Sure.
goes along with being able to do that. And I think especially for someone like you who's involved in activism, thinking about that that balancing act
Mhm.
between really being focused on how to make a positive difference in the world, how to be fully open to the reality of suffering and injustice and inequality and oppression in a way that doesn't make you just completely burn out. So you're no good to
Exactly.
the people you're trying to help, or to your family, or to the people
Exactly.
you love, or to yourself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And oftentimes I will feel guilty, if I'm okay, right? Like how can I be okay when so many people aren't? But then how dare I not? Like if I can be okay enough to then play a particular role, right? To like hold a particular perspective, how dare I not do that? Like it doesn't serve somebody who's caught in survival trying to get food on the table for their family for me to manufacture that for myself
Mm.
just so that I feel somehow in solidarity, right? We all play different roles, right? And so I can get informed by making sure I'm really tapping into the experience of folks that are like caught in that day-to-day survival. And then what is my role? If I have energy left over because I'm not in that, I can utilize that energy to contribute towards making a difference, right? So we all have different capacities. Some people, 100% of their energy is in staying alive right now. And we need them doing that, you know? We need them doing that. Other folks are writing postcards, right? Like we all have different capacities, and we have to collaborate right across those lines versus sort of compete or compare or
Mhm.
judge. That's the way I see it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a refreshing message, because I think that those other approaches can be quite prevalent.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
including judging, shaming. This is the right way to do it. Uh, these are all the things that you don't see that you're actually doing wrong. It's such yeah. There's so much nuance in there.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, with regard to the stuff that we cover on the podcast, is there any particular, I mean, not just that we talk about, but just that sort of area of the intersection of spirituality, politics, what we're going through right now with the pandemic and conspiracy theories, stuff like QAnon, and how that sort of impacts our approach to the election. Um, is there any particular thing that has been up for you that's been impacting you more, or
You know, the thing right now that I'm really reflecting on is my own complicity in like perpetuating these dynamics of like us and them. Now, again, you know me, this is not about bypassing or any sense of moral relativism, but rather the ways that I can feel like, oh, I feel really better than when I see people espousing these beliefs. Like I'm, just like, we often talk about like at Off the Mat, a lot of the work I do is, when you're pointing fingers, you got three other fingers pointing back at yourself, right? And so the ways that I think that the general tone right now is this very binary thinking. You're either like a Democrat, you believe in wearing masks, this is a catastrophe, you know, or you're a Republican and you think it's a hoax, right? Like there's like this strong binary versus so my first thing is, how do I perpetuate that? How am I consuming my news? Am I consuming it in ways that just furthers my judgment and makes me feel self-righteous and good? Even though I do believe and know that my side is correct. It's based in science, it's based in research, right? And we can take it too far. We can get self-righteous and just feed the division. We know how the other side is feeding the division, and it's much more fun to look at how they're doing it. So, I've been really trying to hold myself accountable to the level that I ask people to do. And for me, my edge is that accountability in the face of people having a trauma response and espousing these QAnon beliefs, trying to see it that way, in the face of the reality of, the powers that be, Russian interference, the bots. Like there's a very real scheme to like take over our democracy. Um, but what I can do, because I'm not a politician or a decision maker, my work is in culture change. That's the way that I see my activism. It's in like, how do we talk about this? How do we support critical thinking, but not perpetuate the binary? I think we can do both. And that's been a lot of my thought process lately, is holding that stand, peeling away the unnecessary judgment that just plays into the emotionality of it all. I'm loving listening to grounded scientists and researchers talk. We're able to just be like, let's follow the data. Like, what do we see here? And it doesn't have to be political. So that's been a lot of my own inquiry right now. And of course, like getting people voting, looking at the places where we can be, what are the states we have to be focusing on, and all that. But, for me, I feel like my work is in culture change and in trying to be public about holding a particular attitude. That's, we've lost nuance. When we're in a trauma response, it's very hard to have nuanced thinking. So again, that my life allows me to be fairly regulated. I feel like I have a responsibility to explore what that looks like, feels like, and sounds like, in our movement towards, it's not even justice, just like reasonableness. It's like the bar is so low right now.
yeah,
It is so incredibly low.
yeah. Like, can we get our feet just back on the ground enough to start
Yes.
to look at the world and start to agree on some facts, and begin having the conversations that have been just completely derailed.
Yeah.
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 When you talk about critical thinking, but not falling into the binary or being more nuanced, it sounds to me like you're referencing having strong critical thinking and following the data, whilst also maintaining a kind of open awareness of the humanity of the people who may be on the other side of that conversation, right? On the other side of that disagreement.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, and it's so easy, to, for me to feel like sort of this caricature of like the
Mhm.
QAnon person or the Trump supporter, and I can watch sort of some of the comedy news shows I watch, and who are they interviewing? People that sound like complete idiots, right? And then you think, oh my God, versus like staying curious about sort of the more middle of the road people who still are going to vote that way, who still support those ideas, but
Mhm.
actually sincerely think they're doing something good. And that's kind of more of where I want to try to focus. Who are the people that are just sincerely confused and misinformed?
Totally. Well, that's the thing, and I know this is not news to you of all people, but a lot of people, when the QAnon stuff started to rear its head in the yoga world, were so surprised. How is this possible, right? And so one of the angles I've been taking with that conversation is, well, uh, you seem to think that people who are buying into far right wing ideas or conspiracy theories that are really unreasonable are not doing so with deep sincerity and a deep sense that their heart is telling them that this is the way to go, and that their intuition is sort of this unmistakable guide further and further down the rabbit hole. Like, that's, you can't just say to people, hey, come back to your inner wisdom. They're following their inner wisdom,
Yeah.
but they've gotten confused in some other area about what that inner wisdom is really means, right? Or how reliable it is, or what else they might be following as well, so that the inner wisdom becomes a little wiser.
Exactly.
But there's another aspect to it, which I know is the part that you would have been like, hey, it's not a surprise, people, which is that there's been an unconscious, um, much more unpleasant, far right, racist kind of underlying temperament within our society anyway, that has largely gone unaddressed. And so to say, oh, that could show up in the yoga and wellness space, maybe not such a surprise, right?
Yeah, I mean, and this is something you and I have been talking about for decades, right? Like seeing the ways that that bypass shows up, that confirmation bias, the way that we'll leave sort of our Christian household, but then it adopts a Hindu philosophy, right? The ways that, when we can exotify something, it allows us to even bypass the shadow of like our own roots even more. And so this is inevitable. And in many ways, all right, now the cat's out of the bag, right? We see what happens, how catastrophic it can be to not be examining our beliefs in a critical way, to not be looking at our own traumas and our own, the biases inherent in our culture that we all consume, we're all swimming in. And this has been a big gap in a lot of spiritual communities. And so, again, I know that's been so much of the work we've done together. And I'm pleased to say I don't have one personal relationship with somebody who's fallen for this. Like, I'm like, okay, I have truly been drawn to people who are integrated. I mean,
Yeah,
extended maybe, but like
sure.
nobody that I personally am connected to has fallen for this. And I'm kind of like a pat on the back of like, okay, I've been saying that this is what's meaningful to me. And those are actually the kinds of relationships, work relationships and personal that I've cultivated.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, good job. So to summarize, I was hearing three things. I was here in terms of self-care. I
Yeah.
was hearing, be mindful of not just having an open passageway for all of this media to be coming at you all the time, that is so overstimulating, so upsetting, right? To be caught in some kind of pattern where you're thinking that you just have to keep taking it in, right?
Yeah.
Have some mindfulness about that consumption. The second thing I heard you say is recognize that part of the trauma response is to get really, contracted down into thinking this is all that there is, this is going to go on forever, there is nothing else, right? What it's like to be able to step back enough, and sort of reorient yourself in a way, right, to a larger reality, whatever that is, whether that's your house, your community, your relationships, the world we live in, the cosmos,
Mhm.
the great sort of overarching narrative of humanity's, journey towards more equality and justice and freedom, right?
Yeah.
And then the third one that I heard you say is really pausing and making it a practice to kind of hold space for the vulnerable humanity of people on the other side of whatever polarized binary you
Yeah.
find yourself on politically, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing I talk about for me is like the goal is our collective liberation. That means I have to want the liberation of Donald Trump. Like I have to want that, like, especially the people that are deliberately perpetuating harm. That's a trauma too, right? In the veteran community, we call that perpetrator induced PTSD, right? That the worst trauma comes from what we actually perpetrate, because it goes against our deepest moral compass, right? So understanding that the folks on the extreme have had to dehumanize themselves so
Mm,
much
mm,
to hold a belief that dehumanizes others. And if what I truly want is liberation, I need their liberation. I need to hold them in my heart to the same extent that I'm holding the victims of the violence. And if I don't, then our movement for liberation and justice is always going to be a band-aid. It's always going to be a responding to harm.
mhm.
And until we include those creating harm in our hearts and think about why that happens, we're never going to be free. And so that's a real tough one for me. And I would imagine for a lot of people, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It makes me think. I don't know the exact quote, but there's a Martin Luther King moment in one of his famous speeches about how when we succeed in fully liberating the black man, or black people, white people will find that they too have become unchained, because we are in this dynamic together, and it's harmful to all of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's hard. And that's been, it's hard, and it settles me more, because living in a world where there are all these enemies that I have to protect myself against is very anxiety provoking,
Mhm.
versus the discomfort of asking myself, how do I include these people like in my heart? That's a different flavor of discomfort, but it's actually more settling. It's more integrating.